Well, hello and welcome to this Fireside Chat session titled Balancing Innovation and Security in Payments, a Global Outlook. We're joined in this session by Mr. Suresh Sethi, MD and CEO designate, NSDL e-Governance Infrastructure, who will be in conversation with Sri Shivananda, Senior Vice President and CTO of PayPal. I now request Mr. Sethi to take over the proceedings.
Hi, Shri.
Hello.
I would say good morning to you, whereas it's evening over here.
Good evening to you as well.
Thank you very much. And Shri, let's straight away dive into it. We have a short session. So as we know that the theme of the Global FinTech Fest is around FinTech with and beyond COVID. So clearly the pandemic and what it's driving is going to be a very critical element of our discussion. And we will talk about balancing innovation and security in payments because the two sides go hand in hand. So as we have seen in the current phase, especially with the pandemic coming, the digital payments have been witnessing a very fast-paced growth. I want to contextualize a bit in the Indian sort of scenario. India's informal sector today accounts for almost 80% of its workforce. As a result, we are finding that there has been a significant contraction in the labor force participation, and a lot of disruption has happened in the supply chains in the country. So the opportunity for the tech platforms to build new business models, to be able to create new partnerships and keep these supply chains going on has become very critical. As a result, a lot of businesses are completely shifting their models. Companies which had preparations to do something over a period of years are now truncating and bringing back their policies to do something in weeks and months. So while this growth is coming and going to come, clearly fraud is also on the rise, and hence cybersecurity challenges are going to come to the forefront. So as the new digital business models get defined, I would like to hear your views on the security-related policies and frameworks that need to be incorporated while we work on these revised digital models and supply chains.
Absolutely, Suresh. So when you think about the payments industry itself, security is an underlying foundation that's a must-have. In fact, at PayPal, particularly in the technology arena, we think of security as priority number one. And the reason for this is all of us are in the business of trust. The way we create relationships with our customers that are long-lasting are based on that equation of trust. The fact that they are taking something that is very valuable to them and storing that with our platforms and using it on our platforms, i.e. money. What we need to do is to make sure that we are the best we can be in the security agenda and arena. One of the things that I often talk about is when it comes to cybersecurity, good yesterday is not good enough today. And while online methodologies have, of course, made it extremely convenient and more inclusive for everyone to participate, it's also attracted the bad actors. So one thing we need to all do is understand what that threat landscape is, understand the risk models at play, and put all the controls that are necessary to protect our customers' information, their identity and authentication, and all of their transactions as well. And this is done in a very layered fashion. Like on the first hand, it's about access into the system and who comes in as who and how we authenticate and authorize that. But at the same time, in the context of a transaction, ensuring that the transaction itself will be safe for the customer, both the consumer and the merchant, and the platform itself as we do that. And while we do all this, there are many laws and regulations on how all this needs to be done. So we need to keep in mind that we do this in the construct and constraints of all of those regulations. So we keep the citizens of any nation state is safe around the world. We keep the consumers and merchants safe. We keep the platform safe in the process, while creating an ecosystem of trust that continues to thrive from a transactions kind of perspective. But this is a war that we all need to fight together. This is not a competitive thing. This is all platforms, all governments for that matter, against cyber threat. And we can all learn from each other. We can all use best practices. And this is an area where I highly recommend everyone that is either a large corporation or a new startup to invest significantly to make sure that you're the best in terms of talent, that you're building the best systems possible, because our customers deserve and desire all of that. But Suresh, I have a question for you, which is when you think about security and innovation, and those are the two topics today, how have you seen the balancing of security and innovation? Because sometimes it could be perceived that security may come as a barrier.
So, Shri, a very valid observation. And as we look at, especially in the financial inclusion front, when you are addressing the underbanked or the unbanked or the people who are first time becoming a part of the formal financial economy, the vulnerability of the customer is much more than when you are dealing with a more savvier, partner. In that case, it becomes very critical that how do you go about, I think you mentioned the word trust multiple times in the points that you made earlier. I think trust becomes a very key factor. And with trust, I think literacy. So it is not just financial literacy. As we go about building these new models of payments and digitization, digital literacy becomes a very critical component, because for anybody, and I would say even not so many years ago, when you used to tell people that you can give money and mobile financial services can transfer your funds from one mobile to the other, people just wouldn't believe, because cash was something which was there, which was tangible, which they could touch. The moment they are giving the money to an agent and the agent is doing some magic and making it reappear, miles away in another place. Now, those were things which were very important to digital literacy, trust, and along with that, therefore, becomes a behavior change. So it becomes a very baseline, change of stance. And equally important then becomes the UI UX. And that is where I think when we look at some of the practices today that have been implemented in the country, right from starting with, you mentioned access and auth. When we look at access and authorization today, we are looking at something as simple as Aadhaar. So people don't have to remember PIN numbers. They can simply put their biometric imprint on a machine, and that gives them a secure access to their funds, to their relationships with the financial institutions. And this simplicity in UI UX is a very, very critical factor. I will just share with you an example we always take. When we were looking at the M-Pesa business in Kenya, it was a strong, sort of belief that some services moving totally into a digital mode on the mobile would always be a challenge, because it was a hugely illiterate community out there. So the question became that even though if they can't read, as long as they are numerate. So the telecom company actually came back with a very interesting model where they just told people to remember a string of numbers. So hash 400 was the capability to open the service. After that, there was a series of numbers which would take you to the payment screens. And then the last three digits were the value of the money you want to transfer. So actually what they used to advertise, instead of saying do payments through 1, 2, 3, they would just put a string of numbers and say the last three is the value you want to transfer, and it would work. So numeracy was actually, dominant, and this was the simplicity of the interface which worked over there and did wonders for them in terms of adoption and behavior change and everything. So I think a frictionless technology becomes very critical in these cases.
Absolutely. Suresh, I think one of the things that I want to highlight from there is for many people in the audience who are building any kind of a company, I think the value of designers and product managers looking at the situation, looking at customers' needs, and designing to whatever that context may be is the most critical thing. There's a lot of opportunity, but the best design actually wins in the end, and the UX matters a lot.
Absolutely. No, I would actually put a counter question to you that with the pandemic coming, how are you seeing the change in people's financial behavior? And what trends are you seeing across different countries? While it's early days, but what do you see as a trend emerging out of that?
Look, first of all, I want to say that the pandemic has been very disruptive all around the world. I don't know of an event in my lifetime that has actually disrupted the globe the way this has. And there are, of course, clearly a lot of people that are significantly impacted by this. But at the same time, we are seeing some very interesting trends in commerce and payments as well. Suddenly, cash, which used to be the main medium of exchange, still, in spite of all the digitization pre-COVID, became a thing that could by itself transmit the COVID-19 virus. And so what started to happen was a sudden shift in looking for alternate means. And in those alternate means, it was not a new journey. Digitization has been occurring for a long time, whether it is in terms of shopping or in terms of payments and things of that nature. And given that, it was merely an acceleration. It was taking trends and technologies that existed. And what we have seen is basically a multi-year acceleration of the trends that we would have otherwise projected. And in the middle of all this, what we also see that anything that we do with forecasting has completely gone out of the door. That said, what we notice is overall household spending and consumer spending is definitely down. But the mix is shifting from physical payments to digital payments. People are buying more online. People are using more online services. Or even if they are buying from a brick and mortar and physical stores, they're paying through digital means. And that is a clear shift that's happening. And this is not just limited to shopping. We are seeing it in the area of giving and compassion and kindness. We're seeing it in the area of shopping. Everyday life has changed in a significant way, and digital payments have definitely taken off. I would say one thing for a lot of folks that are looking at COVID-19, there is a ton of innovation to be had in understanding this context, understanding behaviors of people in this context, and tuning the products that already exist to cater to this and beyond. But also in many cases, probably absolutely new business models that could be possible in the situation that we had not thought of before. So while it is a big impact to society, community, and the globe, on the other hand, there are many trends that are quite positive from a business perspective in what's going on in the payments arena.
No, great. I mean, I think directionally, the cost of cash has always been a serious, sort of factor in all supply chains. And if that gets somewhere, moved out, it will create a very, very different sort of equation down the line. And I understand that some of the countries like Sweden, for example, is moving into almost a cashless economy by 2023. That is what they're looking at. And what you mentioned, I think in India also, we bucked the trend to an extent. The last two measurable periods, our digital transactions have been higher than cash withdrawals. And this is what has probably happened the first time, because with people staying indoors and having limited access, that has become one more trend to look at. Now coming to the ecosystem that India has created, when we look at it, it's almost been a decade-long journey. We started with Aadhaar, creating a digital identity at scale across the country. This was followed up clearly providing a universal access. So the PM JDY scheme, which basically addressed almost 360 million people getting bank accounts, today almost 80% plus of the Indian adult population is banked. Add to that the India stack and the capability of having an interoperable payment system, where both the banks and the big tech have participated. It's an open system in place. Now, looking at these and the fact that we've been able to create cash in, cash out points, something I think we are moving away from in the current situation, there was an observation by BIS where they said India was able to achieve in 10 years in terms of financial inclusion what would have taken a 46-year cycle. Now, keeping all this in mind, what are the opportunities you see for these types of enablers which India has put together, which has been a convergence of government and regulatory and technology structures and frameworks coming together? How do you see opportunities for these around the globe?
So first thing I'll say is if you gave me one word to describe this, I would just say brilliant. And that's what it is, right? There is no technical stack in the world that has the prefix of a country's name in front of it. And what the government and the regulators together have done in India with common national identity through a digital system and a common national API for payments, including all of the innovations that have happened in there, it's nothing but brilliant. And therefore, the accelerator, right? First, in fact, as a geek, we always talk about this concept of platform-first approaches. And India happens to be the first country that's focused on a platform-first approach, building the platform in a secure, robust, and reliable way so that it removes the barrier for inclusion, even in innovation, with a lot of parties innovating on that, removing the barrier for a consumer to enter the system. And by the way, it's also an ecosystem play, which is once you get into the payments or get into the identity, you actually begin to start to participate in a large ecosystem. Now, what I would say is it's a role model for many other countries to be following and building as well. But we, as platforms, global platforms, we are global citizens. And as PayPal, we learn from those approaches. We understand the innovation that has occurred there, how it has scaled in India, how to leverage that, and so on. And then add on top of that value added services that we can bring to the table based on years of experience that we have as well. So a strong foundation like the one India offers, and then applying on top various things that we can bring our expertise and experience to is how we see the ecosystem. Now, that said, it'll be important for interoperability to exist between this and the rest of the world's systems as well. Because when I look at Indian merchants, and particularly the small merchants, their opportunities not just exist in India, but they're global.
Sure.
One of the things that's happening with e-commerce, if you will, is the world is becoming one unlimited shelf of goods that anyone, anywhere can buy from. And that access is important for merchants and small players in India to continue to thrive and grow, not just in the context of the Indian buyer, but actually be accessible to a global buyer as well. So if I were to summarize it, a brilliant strategy, one that creates a lot of inclusion and innovation. But I think the next step is how does it interoperate and integrate with the rest of the world systems to where the access for the Indian seller, the Indian merchant, the Indian small business can actually go global.
Great. Now, if we, Shri, looking at your global touch point, if we now do the inverse proposition and talk about saying what global best practices should we further build upon, because while we have this platform, we naturally are looking at now leveraging it, and whether, even at times like these, one, I think the government of India could take a very swift response in being able to reach funds to the last mile to the people by directly crediting accounts. And that has been a very strong, sort of ecosystem which has been created where you can get subsidy and you can, take the role of a welfare, reach money at the last mile. The second part it has really focused on is creating the ecosystem where you can do consumption of goods and create digital supply chains and make them possible. How do you similarly see what other best global practices are there which we should look at in our journey as we build it up from here?
So I'll go back to the theme of our conversation itself. I think it is critical to continue to make sure that from a cybersecurity perspective, all aspects are built into these underlying platforms, and they are. But like I said before, good yesterday is not good enough today. So you need to continue to innovate on that. Because at the end of the day, while convenience is a great reason for people to come and start to leverage the platform, and ubiquity is another reason they continue to stay because it's accepted everywhere. In the long term, trust is built on those security practices and such. And you already alluded to the importance of user experience. And I think understanding customers in every single context and continuing to build products and services that would include the whole market, everybody that wants to participate in moving and managing money is going to be critical as well. Global interoperability is an important thing. And that means the ability to cross borders outward from India and inward into India as well in the trade that occurs. And the digitization of that is an important trend too. What we've also seen is that there is a interesting mix in terms of demographics and age groups and segments and so on. And in the long term, things like continuous experimentation and very curated experiences based on personalization is going to be important. While in the beginning, you can roll products out that are broad and apply similarly to everyone, in the long term, every individual is an individual. And understanding their context and building a product for them is going to be critical too. We are seeing the emergence of trends like afterpay, which is you go through the shopping experience and the decision of how exactly you want to pay for that transaction doesn't need to happen in that instant, but it can happen afterwards. I would also like to say that digital literacy is an important thing, and you alluded to this before as well. And our experience with the PM's digital financial literacy program has been great. It's proved great for the ecosystem in India, which has been rolled with incredible speed and scale, and that's a critical thing. Overall, between the customer ecosystem in India, merchants and consumers, the national stack, India stack as you called it, and the partnership with the platforms like us, like PayPal and others, can make sure that India is taking that step function, which it already has, but continues to accelerate, but at the same time becomes more global with partnerships through players like us as well.
Sure. Sri, what we'll do, we have a few questions coming from other observers and people who are watching the panel. So let's go to them. So first one is very pointed and comes to you directly as the global CTO of PayPal, operating across 200 markets. What is keeping you awake at night in terms of cybersecurity?
Yeah, look, I think cybersecurity is a very important topic and one that is appropriate to stay awake about. And when you see the landscape of cybersecurity, on top of the comments that I already made, you have everybody from a bored college student trying to knock at your door with a little scripted attack, all the way up to cyber terrorism and everything in between. And there are a lot of malicious actors who will either attempt to take over the identity of your customers or the identity of your employees and try to get into the system and either use it for financial benefit or for other malicious intent. It is important to be aware of the threat landscape. And in being aware of the threat landscape, innovate on how you apply all kinds of technologies to address that, while not disrupting the transaction itself, while not disrupting the experience itself. So the magic is like, look, you can build a big fort around the whole thing and protect it so much that nobody comes in, not even your customers. But the balance is in innovating for the experience on one side and innovating for security on the other side, and doing it in a way that all the customers and people coming on to our platforms with good intent go through with ease, convenience, and safety. But at the same time, it has the ability to block any malicious actor the best way you can. This is a race, and I'll call upon all of us again to collaborate on this. Each of us know a lot. Some of what all of us know is common. Some of what each of us knows depends on the scale of our platforms and what may be going on. And some of us, given the surface area around the world, probably know more than most others. But this is an area that is open for collaboration. We should be talking about understanding threats, understanding capabilities, and applying those capabilities as quickly as we can. My advice for all the companies that may be in the audience is treat this as a #1 priority in technology. Invest the money that it deserves. When it comes to security, don't ever compromise. Because while there are a lot of things that are great for revenue creation, revenue protection as an area with high operational excellence is also very, very critical. So making the right investments in security, being aware, doing the right thing, keeping your customer in mind, keeping them safe, building trust, all of that is important in cybersecurity.
Great. I think you answered one more question by default, but I'll just call out the question. But I think the last part of your response actually covered it, because somebody is asking that the digital payments poised to see an upsurge across the globe, then what are the key things that businesses should ensure to minimize fraud? So I think that covers it, and they should be looking at these factors.
Yeah.
You'd like to add anything onto that?
Yeah, Suresh, I'll add a little bit because there is cybersecurity and then there is fraud and risk. Think of it as a layered defense model. Your first layers of protection are all at the network level. Then you come to your edge and you have some edge controls on malicious traffic detection and elimination. Then you get down into the application, and in the application, you actually look at the various factors at play, where the customer is coming from, and so on. And now you get into fraud prevention. In the fraud prevention area, I would like for everyone to assess fully leveraging all of the data that you have. And you've heard a lot about big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and so on. Most of us that are at a sophisticated level of fraud management use all this like a core strength. We invest a lot in taking what may otherwise seem like a data exhaust, taking that, curating it, creating value out of that data, using it in the transaction to make the transaction safe. So cybersecurity is about certain kinds of defenses. Fraud management is actually about brilliance in how you leverage your data, how you use machine learning and AI to actually prevent transactional fraud while it's occurring literally in 300 milliseconds.
No, absolutely. I think a very, very sort of fine observation and distinguishing between the two. The other question which has come forth is that what do you see going forward as being the mode of biometric authentication which you see prevailing in future? Because we've seen fingerprint being there, iris is there in our case because the Aadhaar database also keeps iris. What do you see being the prevalent mode as we go forward? Because as I was mentioning earlier, nothing could be simpler than a biometric because you're virtually carrying your identity with you, and with something like a fingerprint, it is very difficult to actually somebody else do an identity theft or anything, which happens in so many other cases. So where do you see this going?
So when it comes to authentication, I think we across the world have demonstrated at this point in time that there is varying degrees of complexity in breaking different levels of authentication and various levels of user convenience as well. What I mean by that is everybody started with the traditional user ID password. Slowly they moved into other means of authentication, including email verification, phone verification, and things of that nature. But when biometrics started to get ubiquitously and globally scaled and rolled through mobile devices, that became a method as well. When it comes to authentication, what I'm going to say is you should not count on any one means. Multi-factor authentication is the best authentication you can have. If a customer can actually make multiple claims to identity within a transaction or a session, that's the best thing to do. And if you look at it, user ID and password, with the best of compute today, you can actually break passwords, particularly the simpler passwords, within seconds, milliseconds, actually. So first of all, creating complex passwords are important, and that's on one side. But the use of something like a fingerprint adds more factors into the authentication itself. Facial makes it much better. By the way, going from 1 finger to 5 fingers is also good, if possible, right? And then there's finally iris. So if an authentication mechanism in the long term can actually leverage multiple of these things, that will be the safest, most unbreakable, and the least mechanizable in terms of attack, right? So think holistically, think multiple, don't think one.
Sure.
And in this case, 2 sufficiently good authentication methods together make for a rock solid, brilliant authentication overall, right? And that should be the mindset.
Shri, I think we are running out of time, but thank you very much. It was very informative. I hope the audience found it in the same way because it is very pertinent, very relevant in the current context, and gives us a good insight to look at how we create the new business models and make sure that security remains one of the cornerstones as we build these to ensure that the right level of trust and security on customer behalf is built into the business model. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Suresh, thank you for having me today. And these are two important topics. On the one hand, security is very critical to building trusted relationships with our customers. On the other hand, unless we innovate, we perish. If you want to be competitive in today's world, you have to have a culture of innovation and continuously look at customer needs and translate that into iterative experimentation that allows you to roll out new features and services every single day of the year. And you have to balance the two. And there's also an overlap. You have to innovate in the area of security. So great topics, great discussion today. I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me on this panel today.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mr. Sethi and Mr. Shivananda, for a wonderful session. We would also like to thank our partners, PhonePe, Zendesk, and PayPoint for their support, without which this event would not have been possible. With that, we end this session. See you in the other sessions. Thank you, everybody.